encounter with the living Lord, and then what he rose up to be in leadership in the church and giving advice and going forward and encouraging the brethren in the church. And who is he writing to? James in the very beginning indicates that it's the believers that are scattered abroad. And this is most likely due to the persecution that was going on in Jerusalem at that time. And so the Jewish Christians had to disperse themselves out beyond Jerusalem because of the fear of their lives. And so the church was mostly still Jewish in nature. Although they believed in Jesus as the Messiah, as he was prophesied, they still had a lot of their Jewishness left over. Okay, let's move on to the date. Most scholars agree that it was written around the mid-AD 40s. And if you think about it, this isn't even too long after Jesus died and he rose again and he ascended. So this is pretty soon after this event. There's many other reasons that we can go through that historians and scholars have said why this is the date, and I have done all that research for you, so I'm just going to point out a couple things. The first thing being, I was talking about how there was so much persecution going on right in Jerusalem, so the Jewish Christians had to spread themselves out. In Acts chapter 7 through 8, it records this event. And this is somewhere between AD 35 and AD 37. So thus, if James introduces his letter by saying, "To you brethren who are scattered abroad," this event of the persecution in AD 35-37 would have already had to have happened, right, for him to be saying, I'm referring to this event. So we know that it's at least after AD 35-37. And then the other bookend is the council at Jerusalem that we were discussing, right, about the Gentiles and the Jewish Christians and what to do about circumcision and these types of things. That was in the year around AD 50. And so, since James does not mention such a significant event, most scholars assume that that hadn't yet happened. So we have the two bookends of around AD 35 to 37, and we have AD 50. So we find ourselves somewhere in the middle, probably around the mid-AD 40s. And what's perfect is this time frame fits the leadership era of James. And thus, significantly, this makes it the earliest of the New Testament books. The earliest of the New Testament books, most scholars would agree upon. Therefore, this is the first epistle to the first Christians, to the first church that was established. And imagine, this was all that they had. If you wanted to develop your faith as a very new Christian, the only thing in writing that you had that talked about Jesus dying and raising again, and what to do about that, was in this material. So this is pretty significant. Let's move on to the structure and style of James and get to know that a little more. So this book sounds much like a sermon to his beloved brethren. The way that he talks, he even uses the word brethren, or brothers and sisters, over and over and over again to exclaim his affection over them. This book was probably intended to be read publicly at the meetings of the churches. James also makes use of a lot of metaphors and similes. He talks about rule and marine life, astrology, domestic life. He also makes use of rhetorical questions, which we'll dive in deeper to in the next couple of weeks. And he also makes use of excellent Greek, which we already talked about. James is also very direct. Out of 108 total verses that are in the book of James, there's 54 commands given. So nearly half of the verses that are offered are commands, direct imperatives. Do this, don't do this, stay away from this. And as we kind of already alluded to, a lot of this book has a very Jewish nature to it. Again, they were the Jews who saw that Jesus was the Messiah who fulfilled all the prophecies of long ago. So they retain a lot of the essence of their Jewishness. And in that, we see that there's a mention of the synagogue instead of the word church or other type of word to describe it. It also talks about Abraham as their father, something that a Jewish audience would really be able to resonate with. And James also alludes to many illustrations from the Old Testament to make clear his points. Another interesting idea of the structure of James is that James is very similar to the teachings of Jesus. In fact, there are at least 10 parallels to the Sermon on the Mount, something that we'll unpack more too within the next weeks. Another interesting thing that I saw among the commentators that I was reading is that James appears to be very disjointed at first glance. And I noticed this for myself too, even reading it many times. I'm thinking, where's the link between this idea and this idea? It seems like he's just kind of saying this and this and this and this. But let me encourage you that I think that there actually is thematical elements going on in the book of James. And that being said, James is a very practical book. James deals with practical issues of faith that are not bound by culture or place. So even though these issues addressed clearly what the persecuted, scattered members of the church were dealing with then, I think they're very relevant for our lives as well. And that is what is so compelling about James. It was written for you in mind. God wrote this book for you in mind to hear about this over the next 2 months. It is extremely relevant. James deals directly with the old adage, practice what you preach. Now, how many of us have heard people saying that are outside of the church context, the reason why I don't want to go to church, or the reason why I don't trust Christians, or the reason why I don't like Jesus, is because there's so much hypocrisy in the church. I know I, for one, have heard that a lot. And how many of us have thought that and said that ourselves, and have become embittered by that, become discontented, confused, angry? Well, James can help us with that very thing, because the purpose of James is to show us that our faith is supposed to be genuine and authentic and able to be lived out practically day by day, moment by moment. James says that it's not about what we should believe, but what we should do because of what we believe. Again, it's not what we should believe, but it's what we should do because of what we believe. He's less on the theology, like some books like Romans that Paul writes, things like that, and he's more on the practical application. You believe this, then live it out. May there be evidence of that. And as Pastor Max Lucado quotes, do your Monday mornings reflect your Sunday's worship? I love that. Do your Monday's mornings reflect your Sunday's worship? So I want to also bring to your attention a couple things about the books that you guys mostly have by now. So within the books, you will notice that in the front cover, and some of you might not have this yet if you picked your books up a couple Sundays ago, and if so, we have those available for you at the back table. But there's a little sheet of paper which indicates what the talk will be on which passage, and which chapters or lessons in the book you're to go through for your homework. So as it indicates on there, the homework for this next week is chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that will be due by next Tuesday mornings or Tuesday night's session. And on the sheet, it actually says chapters. And just think of it as lessons, because in the book it says lessons, not chapters. So what you'll be doing, if those of you guys are not familiar with the WOW context, is we'll get here in the mornings, we'll pray together, fellowship together, you'll go off to your small groups, and you'll discuss all these things that you have been learning. Things that have challenged you, things that have encouraged you, things that you have questions on that don't seem to make sense, that don't line up with your reality. And you'll discuss these things together, and then we'll come back in here and I'll kind of give a wrap-up of some interesting thoughts that I have, kind of concluding out that passage. And I would encourage you, don't cram all of the homework in on the last day. I know for myself, I have done this many times, but I think you'll get the most out of James if you space it out. Now each week you'll have probably between 3 to 4 days of homework. Sometimes it depends upon the week. You'll have to, again, note that is in your book. And they probably take between 15 to 20 minutes to complete. Of course, you can take longer and journal and pray through it longer, but it should be a pretty manageable task. And a few suggestions for you. I would definitely suggest from the onset, read through the whole book of James. It's short, it's only 5 chapters, it won't take you so long, but I think it'll really help you dive in deep once you understand the broad, sweeping themes that James talks about. Another tool that I have for you that's also available on the back table that you can grab on your way out, it's called a manuscript study tool. Some of you guys have probably done inductive studies before, and this kind of goes along line with it. But the essential idea is, and the direction that it gives on the piece of paper, is to print out the scripture that you want to go through and then mark it up like it's a piece of poetry.